Joel Osteen stood at the pulpit, his signature smile beaming across the massive sanctuary of Lakewood Church. 16,000 people sat locked on his every word, the bright stage lights reflecting off his polished suit as his voice rolled confidently through the speakers. He was in his element, speaking about faith, hope, and God's blessings, the kind of message that had drawn millions to follow him for decades. Then, out of nowhere, a voice cut through the air like a blade. "Pastor Joel, Jesus sent me to give you a message, right now." It wasn't shouted, but it carried with an authority that made every head in the building snap toward the sound. The room fell silent so quickly that even the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Joel froze mid-sentence. His eyes scanned the crowd until they locked onto a man standing in the center aisle, Jonathan Roumie, the actor who played Jesus in The Chosen. Joel's smile faltered. A faint memory hit him, a strange warning Jonathan had given him months earlier, one he'd quietly pushed aside. Now it was back, hitting him like a sudden storm. His hand gripped the edge of the pulpit, the microphone in his other hand felt heavier than ever. Security guards glanced toward the stage, waiting for a signal, but Joel didn't move. Around the room, people whispered, glancing from Jonathan to their pastor in confusion. Jonathan began walking toward the front. His steps were slow, deliberate, each one echoing in the tense silence. The air felt heavier, charged with something no one could explain. Every pair of eyes followed Jonathan's approach, sensing that whatever was about to happen would change everything. And it did. What came next would become the most 2 months before the day Joel Osteen would nearly collapse on stage. The two men met for the first time in a setting that seemed as far from drama as possible, a private Christian media summit in Beverly Hills. The ballroom glittered under crystal chandeliers. Cameras clicked. Well-known pastors, television executives, and Christian influencers mingled over coffee and catered pastries. At the center of it all, Joel was in his element. His latest book had just hit the top of the bestseller list, Lakewood's attendance was at a record high, and every conversation he had seemed to orbit around expansion, growth, and new opportunities for blessing. Surrounded by publicists, staff, and eager listeners, Joel radiated confidence. Across the room, Jonathan Roumie stood quietly, speaking only when approached. He had recently finished filming the newest season of The Chosen, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. For weeks, his nights had been interrupted by dreams that left him shaken and unable to sleep. In them, he saw golden ladders stretching into the clouds, crowded with people climbing toward what they thought was heaven. But just as they reached the top, the ladders crumbled, sending them falling into darkness. Each time, Jonathan woke in tears, feeling the same heavy thought pressing on his chest. They think they're climbing toward God, but they're chasing fool's gold. Joel, meanwhile, was beginning to feel a faint but growing discomfort in his morning prayers. Verses he had preached for years now seemed to speak against him. He couldn't shake Jesus' words to the rich young ruler, "Sell all you have and give to the poor, then follow me." It didn't fit neatly with the message he'd built his ministry on, but he buried the thought under sermon notes and schedules. That night, after Joel's keynote speech about the future of prosperity theology received a standing ovation, Jonathan felt a nudge in his spirit he could no longer ignore. Against his natural reluctance to approach such a high-profile figure, he walked up to Joel as the crowd thinned. Extending his hand, Jonathan smiled warmly. "Pastor Joel, I just wanted to thank you for all the hope you've brought to people. But I've also been feeling led to pray about something in your message." Joel, surprised, shook his hand with genuine warmth. He recognized Jonathan instantly, the face millions had seen as Jesus. "Victoria and I watch every episode," he said with a grin. But as their hands touched, something shifted. For a brief moment, Joel saw not the actor, but the eyes of Christ himself, loving, yet filled with deep sadness. And Jonathan felt something even more intense, a flood of images and words that seemed to come directly from God. Jonathan's voice softened. "I believe Jesus is preparing you for a correction. One that will be hard but necessary. He loves you too much to let you keep leading people away from the narrow path." Joel's smile faltered for the first time that evening. He didn't argue, but his mind raced. A correction? From Jesus? He quickly masked his unease, thanked Jonathan, and excused himself. Still, the words clung to him like a shadow he couldn't shake. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan's dreams grew even more vivid. He saw pastors, some he recognized, some he didn't, standing before crowds, holding out glittering treasures that turned to dust in their hands. In prayer, he felt the message becoming crystal clear. "This is not the gospel I preached. My people are starving, and they're being fed stones wrapped in gold foil." One name kept coming up in his heart, Joel Osteen. Joel's own private struggle deepened. Preparing sermons became harder. Scriptures about self-denial and sacrifice no longer felt like metaphors to him. they felt like accusations. One Sunday, as he preached on financial breakthrough, a single thought pierced his mind: what if I've been wrong? He brushed it aside, but the question returned the next morning, and the next. Jonathan knew what he had to do, though it terrified him. The instructions in prayer were clear: go to him. Tell him the truth. Do it where all can hear. He didn't know how Joel would respond. He didn't know if it would destroy his own career. But the weight of the message left him no choice. Both men were being pushed toward a moment neither of them wanted, but both could feel coming. For Jonathan, it was obedience to a voice he had come to trust above all else. For Joel, it was the gnawing realization that everything he had built might not stand in the light of truth. The stage was being set, quietly, invisibly. Every dream, every doubt, every uneasy prayer was a step toward the collision that was now inevitable. Neither man could stop it. Neither man could slow it down. And when it happened, the shockwaves would reach far beyond Lakewood Church, shaking the very foundations of American Christianity, a shocking moment in modern American Christianity. Joel was in full stride, his voice echoing across the massive sanctuary. 16,000 people sat under the bright lights, hanging on his words about stepping into your season of abundance. The music of his delivery was smooth, confident, familiar. But before he could finish his next sentence, a voice rose from the back of the room, not loud in volume, but sharp in clarity, cutting through the air like a strike of lightning. Pastor Joel, Jesus sent me to give you a message, and it cannot wait. Every head turned at once. The air went still. You could hear the faint shuffle of shoes on the carpet and the distant hum of the building's air system. Joel froze mid-sentence. His eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on a lone figure standing in the aisle, Jonathan Roumie, walking slowly toward the front. Security hesitated, waiting for a signal. Joel didn't give it. Something in his chest tightened. He remembered that night in Beverly Hills. The warning. The unease. And now, here was Jonathan in his church, in front of his people, with a look that seemed to carry the weight of eternity. Jonathan's voice rang out again, steady and unshakable. The gospel you preach is a lie from the pit of hell. You are leading millions away from the narrow gate Jesus died to open. Gasps filled the room. Murmurs rippled across the congregation. Joel's grip on the pulpit tightened until his knuckles went white. Jonathan stepped closer, his eyes locked on Joel's. You've been feeding stones wrapped in gold foil to starving souls. You've told them God's love is measured by their bank accounts when Jesus said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. The words hit Joel like physical blows. His legs trembled. Then, without warning, they gave way. He caught himself against the pulpit, tears spilling from his eyes, tears his congregation had never seen. Gasps turned into shouts. Some people began to cry, others looked on in shock. A woman near the front covered her mouth with both hands. Jonathan didn't stop. His voice grew stronger. Jesus told me to tell you this: choose between your empire and your soul. You cannot serve both God and money. Confess to your people that you've led them astray, and turn from this false gospel now, or their blood will be on your hands. The tension in the room was unbearable. Some people began to pray out loud, others shouted in protest. A few stood to leave, shaking their heads. But most stayed frozen in place, unable to look away. Joel's chest rose and fell rapidly. His face was pale, his suit damp with sweat. For years, he had stood untouchable behind this pulpit, confident in every word he spoke. Now he stood exposed, stripped of every layer of charm and certainty, confronted by a message that went deeper than any human opinion. Security inched forward again, unsure whether to intervene. Joel raised a trembling hand toward them without taking his eyes off Jonathan. Wait. His voice cracked, breaking through the chaos. The room went still again, as if the very walls leaned in to hear what would come next. In that moment, the sanctuary felt like a courtroom. Jonathan was not just a man, he was a messenger delivering a verdict. And Joel was not just a preacher, he was a soul standing trial in front of his own flock. The eyes of thousands burned into him, waiting for his answer. The air was thick, electric, almost frightening. What Joel said next would decide not just his future, but the faith of the people staring back at him. Jonathan's final words hung heavy in the silence. Choose now, Pastor Joel. Your empire or your soul. The sanctuary was silent, the weight of Jonathan's words still hanging in the air. Joel's shoulders trembled as he gripped the pulpit. Then, with a voice broken and raw, he spoke words no one expected. Church family. I've been wrong. 4 years. I've preached a gospel that promised you wealth instead of the cross. I told you your best life was now, when Jesus said to lay down your life for him. I've led you astray, and I am so sorry. The sound that followed wasn't applause or cheers.
It was chaos.
Half the room erupted in shouts of protest, angry voices rising as people gathered their belongings and stormed toward the exits. Others fell to their knees in tears, praying aloud, repenting right where they sat. Some just stared at Joel, stunned, as if they couldn't process what they were hearing. Within hours, clips of the moment hit social media. Millions watched the tears stream down America's most famous prosperity preacher's face as he confessed to building his ministry on a lie. The video went viral overnight, trending worldwide, sparking debates on news channels and Christian platforms alike. The cost came quickly. Television networks canceled his programs. Publishers pulled his book deals. Invitations to conferences disappeared. By the end of the month, Lakewood's attendance had dropped by thousands, and offerings had fallen to a fraction of what they'd been. Joel and Victoria moved out of their mansion into a modest home, selling off personal assets to pay off debts. And yet, something unexpected began to grow. The 8,000 who stayed were not clinging to the old message, they were hungry for something real. Testimonies began pouring in, not of financial breakthroughs, but of hearts and lives transformed. A wealthy member sold his luxury home and used the money to build shelters for the homeless. A businesswoman shut down her thriving company to serve overseas as a missionary. Week after week, the stories spread, not of prosperity gained, but of sacrifice given. Joel's ministry became unrecognizable from what it once was. No more stadium crowds. No more perfectly polished sermons about claiming your blessings. Now, on a Sunday morning, Joel could be found sitting in a circle with 30 or 40 people, Bible open, speaking quietly about the cost of following Jesus. Other pastors began to notice. Some called him privately, confessing their own doubts about prosperity teaching. A few even followed his example, publicly turning away from it despite knowing they would lose much. 2 years later, Joel's influence looked nothing like it had before. Smaller in number, but deeper in impact. What he lost in money, fame, and comfort, he gained in truth, peace, and the knowledge that his message no longer led people toward the wrong gate. And now, the question he faced that day stands before every person hearing his story. Which Jesus are you following? The one who promises you riches in this life, or the one who calls you to carry a cross? Because they are not the same. Only one can save your soul.